Hi, this is Joe, N2QOJ, and this is the narrated version of the Radio Communication Basics presentation that was presented to the Mesa Are You Prepared group on February 21st. This presentation really has three objectives. To present some basic radio communication information, to talk about the kinds of radio services that are available to members of Mesa Are You Prepared, and also to present some basic information regarding amateur radio, also known as ham radio. Let's start with some basic radio communication info, and this topic we're going to pick is Simplex versus Duplex. Two ways of communicating by radio. In other words, directed versus assisted. And what we mean by this is simplex or direct is really one person using a radio talking directly to another person on the same frequency with nothing in between, nothing to assist them. That's simplex. They're using one frequency and they're talking directly to each other. Assisted means that these two individuals are speaking to each other, but they are actually going through some other apparatus, such as a repeater, a device that that's located in a good spot to help with minimal power and height, altitude issues, maybe obstruction issues. So there's something in between, and usually there's different frequencies being used for going into the repeater and coming out of the repeater. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Let's look at the case here of simplex or direct communication. Again, one user is talking to another user directly. Let's look at the basic definition. Contacts made between hams using FM frequency modulation on the same frequency are referred to as simplex. When one person is talking, he's pushing the button, and the other person is releasing the button to listen. So push to talk, release to listen, and it's direct. In the case of duplex or assisted communications, two individuals are contacting each other, but they're going through an apparatus, typically a repeater. The formal definition here at the bottom reads, contacts made between hams using frequency modulation via a repeater are referred to as duplex, or we call it sometimes duplex operations. Let's spend a little time talking about what a repeater is. First, the definition at the bottom. The definition is a repeater retransmits or repeats FM signals that adheres on one frequency via another frequency simultaneously. The received signals are not stored and played back. They're rebroadcast on a different frequency at the same time they're received, which is called duplex operation. That's key. You need to remember this is simultaneous. There's no store and forward here. One person is talking, the other one is listening, and the repeater is doing double duty. It's listening and retransmitting on a different frequency at the same time. Look at the diagram on the left. Here's a basic breakdown. We have an antenna, a receiver and transmitter within the repeater. And then we describe and represent radio on each side to represent the users. This is very simplified. In reality, if you look towards the right side, lower picture, there's a duplexer. That is the device that allows the repeater to use one antenna system and simultaneously. It provides the isolation needed to keep that transmitted and received frequency from interfering with each other while using one antenna. The center picture is a rough idea of what a homebrew repeater looks like. This repeater was built for the Queen Creek Emergency Communications Group. There's a power supply in the bottom. The middle shelf holds a receiver and transmitter, two mobile radios. The lighted item is a controller, a repeater controller that's specifically made for these types of functions. And sitting on the very top, still in bubble wrap, is the duplexer. Let's look a little closer at a repeater and why one would want to use that for assisted or duplex operations. And we're going to try to address why and how. If you look at the graphic here, it's an interesting scene. You have on the lower left a valley. Immediately to the right, you have an individual user with a portable radio at a very much elevated location. There's a mountain in between the valley and the opposite side, which there's a mobile traveling towards a distant town or city. If you look at the individual with the portable radio, he has a direct line of sight, which is what we need for VHF and UHF communications, right down to a user in a home in the valley. So he doesn't need any assistance. He's got a direct line of sight with a portable radio. He can go many, many, many miles. However, for that person in the valley at the base, if he wants to communicate with that mobile who's traveling on the other side of the mountain, he needs to use the repeater. And it's a great thing to have available. The reason for that is the repeaters are typically mounted on mountains at a obviously elevated altitude. They typically are operating with very good equipment, antenna structures, antennas with gain for both receiving and transmitting. And that kind of installation really mitigates several items. It mitigates terrain issues. It allows you to operate in much larger areas, what we call RF footprints. It mitigates the problems of any obstructions that might be in the line of sight between the two users. And that's exactly what would be used here. The end result is that a repeater allows us to communicate much farther with less power and unimpeded by line of sight issues. Repeaters are a great asset to our community in ham radio and certainly in businesses as well. And something to definitely consider in your planning and use of radio communications for normal and emergency operations. Let's get some semantics out of the way here. When we talk about people operating radio communications, there's typically three scenarios. They may be operating at a fixed location, which is typically their home base, where they're typically and normally located. If they're licensed, it's probably where the license reflects their address. The second would be portable operation. That means that they're operating in a different fixed location. They've taken their station and they are operating in a remote area, maybe a vacation cabin, maybe at a hotel, maybe just out in a field somewhere in a park. But they're not mobile. They're not moving. They're just portable. They're stationary. But it all reflects back to your home fixed location. You are operating portable from there. You carried your station and now you're operating. The third type is mobile. Mobile, you're moving. You're moving relative to your home station. You could be moving in several different ways. You could be moving while you're driving, vehicular mobile. You could be moving while you're walking. That would be pedestrian mobile. While sailing, that would be marine mobile. Or maybe you have a plane and you're flying. It would be aeronautical mobile. The point is you're mobile. You're moving relative to your fixed location. And that's how you want to represent yourself when you're speaking to someone. If they ask you where you're located, well, you can tell them that you're operating fixed at your home station. Or you may be operating portable. You're a couple hundred miles away in vacation, in a vacation location. Or you might be mobile on your bicycle, bicycle mobile, or just walking, taking a walk. That's some of the definitions we use to make sure people understand exactly where we're located. That gives them a sense of do we have obstructions? Are we able to change our location if there's a problem, and so forth. We are not referencing what kind of radio you're using, a mobile radio or a handheld portable radio. That is completely different. We are talking about your operating location or mode. Continuing on a little bit regarding semantics and basic definitions. Let's talk about local versus distant communications versus DX. More common in ham radio terminology, DX. Local. When we say we're speaking locally to someone here, we're really talking about the valley. Local means your local town, communities, surrounding areas. That's local. When we talk about distant, we're talking you're speaking to someone well outside your area. That could be regional, say the Southwest. You could be talking to another state. Basically, any across the country. We're talking about distant. Once you leave the boundaries of the United States, that's what we're calling distant stations, DX, and that really references being out of the boundaries of the country. So DX would be anywhere outside the U.S. worldwide. That would also be Mexico, Canada. So it's good to understand because when somebody talks to you and says, "Hey, you're speaking to me on HF, and I'm only 40 miles from you. I am local to you. I am not a distant station." Same thing with DX. Some people want to only speak to DX or out-of-country stations for whatever reason. They may be contesting. They may be looking for information outside the country, a different perspective about what's going on here, that kind of thing. So it's good to know this terminology as well. Another important aspect about basic radio communications, you have a radio, you have a good idea if you want to talk local or distance with and so forth. You always need to consider powering your radio. Yes, if you have a handheld radio, you've got a battery pack, but that battery pack's eventually going to have to be charged or replaced by a battery replacement device or, again, charged. Where do we get these power? Where are these power sources for us to use? Well, simple terms, batteries. Besides the battery on the radio, you can use most any kind of battery intended for powering DC devices. For example, this picture on the top represents like an alarm battery, a 7-8 amp hour battery. There could be larger batteries, could be automotive batteries, marine batteries, deep cell batteries. You can use one or two, or you can have a complete bank of batteries in order to power your station or some support hardware and so forth. Vehicles are a great source of DC power. I have an outlet on my motorcycle. Of course, your vehicle, boats, and any vehicle typically can provide power to your handheld or mobile radio, or if you're in a fixed location, portable location, could potentially power a more powerful station for you. Then, of course, we have the solar and solar battery combination. Solar systems, such as what's represented here. This is personally used by Dennis, KF7RYX. Those are putting out typically between 14.5 and 16 volts at about 10 amps, and it can power some radios directly, especially mobile radios, but normally what it's being used for is to power a battery bank. A battery bank that can be used later on in the evening, or it could be powering an inverter directly as well, or an inverter off the battery. Similarly, same thing with generator battery. Generators can be used to power directly, but most likely to you want generators after hours or to not only provide power but also charge some of your battery systems as well. In the lower left, we're showing some battery replacement devices and connectors and standard connectors on the right. Those are Anderson power poles. Those are the kind of connectors we use in ham radio. So we can interconnect many different things, especially power sources, and exchange items between different users in case someone needs a battery pack. We've got that standardized. We'll look a little bit closer at connectors here on this slide as well. But of course, we always have power supply unit type devices for at-home fixed locations, where these are power supplies, AC units. They can be plugged into 110 volts, and they will output 12 or 13.5 volts DC to power our DC radios or step-down transformers and so forth, or a place to plug in reduced power connectors and so forth for handheld radios. Again, on the bottom, the connectors will give you a little bit closer look at the Anderson connectors on the right. In the center, that's a typical battery replacement cord. You take off the battery on an HT, slip that in, plug it into your 12-volt DC in your car, and it's called a battery eliminator. And it will. There's electronics in there, and it steps down the power for what the battery needs. So let's review some of the basic radio communications information we discussed. We've discussed Simplex versus Duplex. These are the two most common modes that you users, especially in emergency situations, would use. You'd use Simplex direct to in your family or friends. You would, in close proximity or reasonable proximity, you'd be using radios direct to each other. Or you'd be using Duplex through repeaters to give you a larger footprint, such as a local valley area. We discussed the three different modes that you may be using a radio in. Fixed, meaning your location at home. Portable, meaning relative to your home, you're operating in a fixed location but not your home. And that could be anywhere from your vacation home to a park or whatever the case may be. Then, of course, if you're operating mobile, you are moving relative to your home location. We also discussed some terminology of local versus distance versus DX. That's kind of important because for most uses you're going to be talking in a local fashion. But there are times that you might want to talk out of the area, in the Southwest region or out of state, to learn or get more information of what might be going on in a different part of the country, or what might be going on in, what their perspective of what's going on in your area. And of course, for more hobbyist reasons, you might want to be talking DX, which is outside of our country for various reasons. We also talked about power sources, batteries from vehicles, solar, and generator, of course, home power supply units, and the various connectors that hams use. If you look at these four categories, these are the kind of items you have to be or topics you have to be concerned about. If you're going to set up a couple of radios or outfit you and your family, think about it. Are we going to be using repeaters? Are we going to be talking direct to each other? If we're going to do both, we want to make sure we have an HT or a handy-talkie or mobile radio that can do both of those things. Bubble pack radios like FRS or GMRS typically are not going to allow you to talk duplex through repeaters. Are we going to need something in our vehicles when we're mobile? Are we going to need something fixed location? Certainly while we're mobile, we're definitely going to want something to use. You've got to consider that. Where are we going to operate these radios? In close proximity? Is it possible that our family or our friends will be distanced from each other in hundreds of miles versus tens of miles? What do we need to plan for in terms of power sources? Do we need batteries? Do we need solar cells and chargers, inverters? These are the kind of things you need to think about when you're setting up your radio communications plan. At this point in the presentation, we're going to discuss the types of radio services that are available to folks like us and who are planning for emergency communications or simple communications and other times. There's several services available. Let's start with the most well-known for individuals, and that would be amateur radio, or also known as ham radio. Ham radio has an interesting attribute in that we can operate ham radio frequencies available to us in bands from very close proximity to over 500,000 miles in distance. Well, we know the Earth is only about 24,000 miles in circumference, so where does this 500,000 miles come from? Well, hams actually can communicate to other hams on the planet via signals that are transmitted and bounced off the moon. Let's say the distance to the moon is an average of 250,000 miles. So that's a two-way trip. That's 500,000 miles. Of course, in between that, we have satellites, space stations that we can also communicate with directly and back to Earth. There's actual repeaters and transponders on some of those satellites. And then, of course, we can communicate worldwide through HF bands, what some of you may be familiar with as shortwave type bands. And then, of course, for local work, we have VHF and UHF frequencies. The frequency spectrums of ham radio range anywhere from the tens of kilohertz or 100 kilohertz to over 30 gigahertz. And those bands are identified. There's band plans for each. Some are experimental, others we might have to share with some folks, but that's the widest range of available frequencies to any group in the world, really. Then we have the General Mobile Radio Service. Some of you are familiar with. Those are the GMRS frequencies. Those are not the family radio system bubble pack radios, but something a little bit more capable, usually with 22 channels. They operate with a little bit more power. They're only in the UHF band from 462 to 467 megahertz, so they're really meant for close proximity usage, meaning local. Radio systems, the bubble pack radios at 14 channels or so, those only operate up to 250 milliwatts to 500 milliwatts, very low power. So very close proximity usage. Fun for kids and families, or maybe in an amusement park or something like that, neighborhood. They're in the same frequency range, and the mode is voice on all of these. Multi-use radio systems. There's about 5 frequencies available in the VHF band, 151 to 154. And here you'll hear Walmart, Target, and local communities, users. I've heard people, communicating from balloons to their chase vehicles on it, blimps, and so forth. Again, there's only 5 of them. It's only for voice, and they're limited in power, about 2 to 5 watts, handheld usually. Then we have the Citizens Radio Service, which some of you are familiar with, CB, very popular since the early 70s. Lost a lot of its popularity, but it does operate in the HF region. It is local communication. However, the properties of that band, under certain conditions, it can be great distances. However, it's not reliable. It's not all that predictable either. And then we have a couple of things in the maritime radio service. Some of you may be boat owners on lakes. There's VHF frequencies available for that, and which allow you to communicate to Coast Guard, other boaters, and so forth. And then there's worldwide maritime frequencies for folks on vessels and in blue water all around the world that need to communicate, get weather information, talk to Coast Guards and other authorities and so forth, check into nets and whatnot. If you notice, all of these services are voice capability. However, when you look at ham radio people are not limited to just voice. They can use Morse code, digital modes, everything from faxes and image transmission, and even video. We have slow scan television and regular fast scan television as well. So it's really a very broad usage, availability of modes for ham radio. In the maritime services, folks there typically will use phone or sideband for worldwide and contact when they're in the open seas, but they can also use digital too, for email and for getting weather data and so forth. These are the systems and radio services available. All are regulated by the FCC. Some licensing is required, and we'll get to that next. Now we could see here, talking a little bit more about radio services that are available. The highlighted in yellow services are actually licensed. All are regulated by the FCC, meaning that there's regulations for frequencies and modes and usage and constraints and restrictions and so forth. However, the FCC doesn't really offer licensing for all of these services, only for amateur radio, of course, which some of you have already enjoyed studying and taking some tests and getting licensed. The General Mobile radio service actually requires, if you look at those bubble pack radios that claim 22, 34 miles and 22 channels, if you read it closely, it does say FCC license required, and that's about an $80 license for 4 years of operation. There's no testing involved, just pay a fee. The maritime radio service, of course, because of worldwide operation, and is certainly licensed as well and regulated, but definitely licensed. If you notice, all the services that are licensed are the services that typically allow you to operate not just local but distant. You're crossing state boundaries, regional boundaries, country boundaries. Normally, with such a radio service, there has to be some kind of license regulation. In other words, enforcement of the regulations and consequences. And in General Mobile radio service, they are capable of having repeater systems as well. Therefore, a bit more than just standard local direct communications, so it's licensed as well. And the General Mobile radio service is not only for individuals and families, but for some light business use as well. So there you have it. Those are the available radio services to us, and we'll soon talk about the benefits of one of these services for our use. And you can probably understand and appreciate and guess which that'll be, and that'll be amateur radio, because of the vast number of bands available to us, the distances that we can communicate, and the different modes. Let's begin our discussion about ham radio. A little introduction on ham radio basics and what it is, some of its benefits, and so forth. And remember, ham radio and amateur radio are one of the same. First of all, ham radio, since the earliest part of the 20th century, has been established worldwide in all regions of the world. In amateur radio, the world is broken up to 3 regions. Europe and its neighboring areas, it would be Region 1. We are in Region 2, the Americas, North, Central, South America. And then the Asian area of the world is Region 3. As you might imagine, being around that long, and with its popular attributes, we have a very large base of users around the world, about 2 million in total worldwide. And those 2 million people enjoy something of a common environment. The equipment that we use is basically the same available pool of equipment all over the world. There's specific manufacturers that provide this equipment, and not only just the transceivers, but antennas, supporting devices such as antenna matchers, power amplifiers, all kinds of equipment. But it's common. So you'll be speaking to someone in another country, and they could be operating the same radio as you. We have a common language and protocol and practices, meaning that you can be speaking to someone in another country, and they know how to get engaged in a conversation. They know how to convey what their equipment is, and typically when we talk about how we're using our equipment and so forth, we use common terms and so forth. And the practices, most countries, the amateur licensing is very similar in the regulations. How to speak with people, how to identify, what bands you can use, and so forth. There's so many similarities, so it's very, very common. These 2,000 folks worldwide, I mean, they can come from any walk of life. Could be doctors, could be plumbers, could be folks, teachers, astronauts. It doesn't really matter. Lots of people have interest in ham radio, and they come from all walks of life. Subsequently, some of those folks have a very strong technical background, and there's a very large and deep knowledge base within amateur radio. Amateur radio has spawned many different technologies. Cell phones, for example, came from that environment. A lot of experimentation goes on in amateur radio, and you'll find amateur radio everywhere, in NASA, satellites, in emergency operations, and folks with commercial communications and professional communications. They'll typically be or have licensed amateur radio operators in those fields. Amateur radio is regulated both nationally and internationally. For example, in our country, the organization that administers our airwaves and frequencies is the Federal Communications Commission, and they regulate amateur radio in this country. As far as worldwide, countries have their own organizations that are similar, but there are international organizations such as the International Telecommunications Union, International Amateur Radio Union, and there's such a thing as a Worldwide Amateur Radio Conference. Those organizations basically determine how bandwidth, or I should say RF radio frequency spectrum around the world are utilized. They understand where they cannot transmit in terms of government operations, emergency rescue operations. Some of those things are standardized worldwide. And then on occasion, every several years, the Worldwide Amateur Radio Conference gets together and looks at specific issues for an amateur radio. For example, are there requirements to upgrade some of the regulations? Has technology changed in amateur radio, forcing some things to be, some legacy items to be, outdated and so forth? There's quite a bit of an organization within amateur radio, not in a regulatory sense, but in an actual hobby sense and usage sense. Our spokesperson or agency or organization that speaks on behalf of amateur radio, both in regulation lobbying and fostering the hobby, is the ARRL, located in Newington, Connecticut, and that is the American Radio Relay League. And they of course have a national presence, a regional, and a state presence across the country, and they offer conventions and contests and so forth, things like that. We also have local clubs here in this area. We've got a tremendous amount of clubs: Superstition, Thunderbird. We have the Queen Creek Amateur Radio Club. Lots of clubs. Some are dedicated to service, for example, testing. Some are dedicated to providing community service. Some are dedicated to specific interests like long-range DX operating, HF contesting. Some are dedicated to just CW users or enthusiasts. And these contests are not only local but also worldwide, and there's schedules for these. And some people in the hobby really enjoy the ability to hone their skills and craft within amateur radio by engaging in these contests. The licensing for ham radio is open. All the questions, pools of questions and pools of answers are published. So there's many different ways you can learn formally by getting study books and actually learn the theory and the regulations and so forth and test yourself. Or you can just, get the open question pools and memorize and go through that process. And there's a lot of online tools and other things to help you to do that. One of the major benefits of this existing amateur radio community in the world is that there are thousands of repeaters, and we know the benefits of repeaters from earlier discussion available. There's thousands of repeaters and link systems in place in our country alone, where you can talk from your handheld radio here locally. You can link to systems that allow you to be talking in Idaho, Utah, California. Furthermore, we have link systems that are gateways to other systems around the world through the internet. So you can talk on your handheld radio, access one of these local systems, and then be talking into Tokyo or Stockholm or Apache Junction. It doesn't really matter. It's established, and why wouldn't you want to make use of that, especially in your planning for emergency operations? Let's review a couple of items of benefits of ham radio specific to the Mesa Are You Prepared group. Licensing is open, as I mentioned before. All the questions and answers are published. Open licensing means that there's no age restriction as well. If you can take the test and pass it, you will be afforded the privilege of a license and the privileges that go along with those licenses. There's lots of online study and test preparation tools available. We presented some information of where you can find those. Volunteer examiner testing sessions are available 13 times a year in the local area from the East Mesa volunteer examiner team, headed up by Fred Bollinger, on the third Monday of every month. And there's also available testing on, I believe it's the second Saturday of the month by Fred's team in Gilbert. But that's limited to about 4 people at a time and has to be scheduled in advance. The one in Mesa is open. You show up with your fee of $15 plus photo ID and any existing license information if you are upgrading, and you can join the session there. Specifically for members of this group, we've placed on the file section of the meetup.com study guides and a lot of other information to help you out, including information about your first time using repeaters and so forth, basic information on how to use repeaters, and lots of other stuff as well. For example, lists of local 2-meter and 440 or 70 centimeter repeaters in the area. That's all there. Remember, assistance with studying is available. Myself, Bruce, Dennis, and other folks, other hams within this group will certainly lend a hand. More experienced hams, when they provide that kind of service to a new ham or an experienced ham but may not be familiar with a certain aspect of the hobby, we call that experienced ham who provides that service an Elmer. And we're happy to provide Elmering services to folks as necessary. And again, special testing sessions will be arranged for this group as needed, just as we had back in February. So take advantage of all these tools and available resources for this group. So let's say you have an interest in ham radio and getting your license and so forth. Where do you start? Well, remember, for licensing information, read the resources, access the resources in the meetup.com area, files area. There's information there on the study guides. There's information on where the testing is located, how often that's provided. Go to the ARRL website. Use the links that are on this slide, and you can find a vast amount of information to help you in your effort to learn more and get licensed. Online practice testing for free at these different locations noted here with these links. If you'd like to actually go to a little bit more advanced service, not exactly free, but very popular and proven and very, very popular with ham radio people, consider hamtestonline.com. And again, if you would like more information about the volunteer examiner team, where they meet, how often, and the testing, and what you need to bring with you in your preparation, that information is in the file section of the website, but also repeated here for you as well. Again, any questions at any time, you can always contact myself or Dennis or David, Michelle, or any of the hams probably in the group. Okay, so you've pursued the ham radio license route, you've gotten licensed. Where do you start in terms of equipment and so forth? Well, most of you already done that. You've got a handheld radio. A handheld radio will get you most of the local coverage in this area, give you access to all the repeaters in the valley, and if you need to source a radio and have it programmed with some basic frequencies, useful frequencies in the area, not only ham but others, Dave can assist with that. Most important, when you have that radio in your new license, practice. Use the local ham community repeaters. Participate in the weekly net that we've begun for this group on Sundays at 8 p.m. But most importantly, follow the basic repeater usage guidelines that are posted in the group. Listen to some of the popular repeaters at commuter times in the morning and afternoon. You'll hear quite a bit of interaction with folks, and listening is the best thing you can do to help yourself learn how to use these systems. And there's not much to it, but it's good to get on and use the proper methods. Remember, it's plain English. We don't use any 10-code language like CB, or we really try to minimize the terminology, any as much as possible, especially in FM radio. Support. Don't hesitate to ask for support of your Elmers, myself, Dennis, other hams in the group, and so forth. You really you have a lot of resources available to you, not just us. If we don't have an answer, we'll get an answer for you or point you in the right direction. Or, very importantly, if you have questions that are worthwhile for the rest of the group, we'll be sure to put something together as a document or a presentation to get out to everyone. And we'll keep a roster of available folks for you to contact, and we'll publish that soon as well. The last item I wanted to share with you is a little bit insight into the publicly available question and answer pools for the different license categories. They're typically, the license pools questions and answers are typically renewed in every 4 years. The technician class is still current, but ends this year, June 30th, 2014. And a new set will be published. So all the current study materials, both paid for and free online, reflect what's currently available. So if you're looking to get your technician license with the tools that are out there now that we've discussed, now's the time. You can see how many questions are in each exam. The questions are, for the technician, is 396 questions in total. On the exam, though, you would only be questioned on about 35, have 35 questions. And those cover really about 10 specific topic areas, covering certain aspects of technical issues, certain aspects of regulatory issues, best practices, and so forth. And you can see for the rest, for general and extra, which are the other two levels, amateur extra being the top level, you can see the number of question pools available and the number of questions per exam. Now, when you take a test and you pass your technician, for example, and you've paid your $15, you will be given the chance and be asked, would you like to take the general test? There's no additional cost. As long as you keep passing, you can keep taking, and so in effect you can take all three if you've prepared, pass, and it only costs you $15. That's a lot to do. Some people do it, but it can be done. So remember that you can, if you'd like to be prepared, take more tests as long as you pass the technician. And even if you haven't studied, I would recommend take the general class, especially if you've done very well on the technician with a very high pass rate. Take the general test just as a bit of a training for the next time. So that's the information there. This is publicly available. Typically, if you would just Google question pool amateur radio, this kind of information is definitely available at any time to you. Thanks for watching, and please check out these available resources from Queen Creek Amateur Radio Club.